Welcome to Lecture 3. In the last lecture, we learned about the basic science behind immunity and vaccination. In this lecture, we will be talking about ethical issues related to vaccination. We will focus on 4 key ethical issues surrounding vaccines, mandates, research and testing, informed consent, and access disparity. So what is a mandate? Well, a mandate is generally considered to be some kind of command or an order handed down from a superior to the underlings. In the context of what we are talking about, the superior would be the government and the underlings would be the citizens within that country. Typically, opting out of a mandate should require some action beyond simply saying no. There should be some enforcement mechanism to encourage compliance, which means there should be some kind of penalty for opting out. Now, the penalty might not have to be a very harsh penalty. It could be just a mild penalty, a mild financial penalty in most cases for people who are opting out of the mandate. Typically, the penalty for not following the mandates for vaccination involves not allowing the unvaccinated child to attend school, along with some sort of fine. As you can see here, here are some examples from around the world. In Germany, Italy, there are both monetary fines related to non-compliance. In Germany, it is around 2,500 euros, which is approximately $2,750 US. And in Italy, it is about 500 euros, and that converts to $560 in US. And you can see the fine varies from country to country. And in countries like France, they opt for a more mild approach with no fine for not following mandates. In New South Wales, Australia, the penalty is a little bit harsher. As you can see, they have something called the No Jab, No Pay legislation, which was passed in the year 2018. Under this new law, unvaccinated kids cannot attend preschool and daycare. And if the people operating the preschool or daycare, if they're caught admitting unimmunized children, they will also be fined. Okay. Furthermore, parents with unimmunized children, they will not be eligible for child care benefits. Some people criticize that this will disproportionately affect lower income families who are more likely to be dependent on child care benefit, and they might not have a choice but to get their children vaccinated, even though they might not want to, okay, because their livelihood is dependent on the child benefits. So, you know, they might not have a choice but to vaccinate their kids, even though they don't want to, right, in order to get the child benefit. As for Canada, only Ontario and New Brunswick have mandate for children vaccination. Okay, so in these provinces, children must be vaccinated for a list of diseases in order to attend school. And everywhere else in the country, vaccination is actually voluntary. In Ontario, there is the Ontario Immunization of School Pupil Act, or ISPA for short. This act requires that children and adolescents attending primary or secondary school be appropriately immunized against designated diseases unless they have a valid exemption. The immunization schedule for Ontario is actually listed on the yellow card. You might remember having one of these when you were younger, and if you have kids, then you know your kids would have one of these things. It's a paper record of all the immunization that your child or yourself has received. And because it's a paper record, it's easy for people to misplace these things, and so sometimes the record is a little bit incomplete. But in this yellow card, you would be able to see the immunization schedule that is listed on the top, and it basically tells you what shots are needed and at what age. Here's the list of vaccines under mandate for Ontario and New Brunswick. Our list contains 3 extra vaccines that are not found on the New Brunswick list. The vaccines offers protection for meningococcal diseases, which is basically meningitis, the inflammation of this membrane that goes around the brain, and it protects against pertussis, which is also known as whooping cough, and it's a serious respiratory disease, as well as protection against varicella, which is another name for chickenpox. Under ISPA, children without required immunization records or a valid exemption may be temporarily suspended from school until the required records are provided. So there are no monetary fines associated with non-compliance to the mandate, but they will be, the kids, the unvaccinated kids will be pulled from school. In fact, each year, many students face potential suspension because they don't have the proper immunization record. One of the most common reasons people don't have the proper immunization record is because they cannot find the yellow card, right? As I mentioned earlier, the yellow card is a paper record, and people misplace the card sometimes, and they might not be able to provide a record without the yellow card. And sometimes we have children who are immigrants from other countries, and they might not have a complete record from their own countries, and so fail to provide an updated record will result in the student being suspended from school temporarily. Under ISPA, parents can opt out of the mandate if they have valid reasons, and there are 3 valid reasons that are going to be accepted. For example, the first one is prior immunity. So, for example, let's say a kid when he was still a baby or a 1-year-old, the baby contracted chickenpox from his older sibling, okay, and then the child recovered from it. So now they are going to have a full immunity against chickenpox, and that means the child will not need to have the varicella vaccine, right? They don't need to have the chickenpox vaccine because they already gain immunity through natural means. So that is definitely a valid reason for not getting vaccination. The second reason is medical contradiction. If the person is immunocompromised, meaning they have a weakened immune system, or if they're undergoing cancer treatment, for example, then the vaccinations would not be possible. Okay, so that is going to be a valid exemption reason as well. And lastly, the third one is based on an affidavit. An affidavit is basically a sworn statement that can be used in court. An affidavit of conscience or religious belief, which basically means parents can opt out if they believe vaccination is not good for their children. Okay, so here are the 3 valid reasons for opting out of the mandate. In order to use the third reason to opt out, a parent must complete a statement of conscience or religious belief and have it witnessed by a commissioner for taking affidavits if they wish to obtain a non-medical exemption for their child. Due to the increased number of parents opting out vaccination for their children based on conscience and religious belief, Ontario has actually introduced an extra requirement for the opt-out process. As of September 1st, 2017, parents need to go to the local public health unit to complete an education session that covers the following information. Okay, so there are basic informations about vaccination, vaccine safety, immunization and community health, as well as immunization law in Ontario. So parents are required to complete this info session before they could complete the exemption process. The goal of this extra step is to ensure that parents are actually making an informed decision. Now we will look at some arguments from proponents and opponents of mandates. For proponents of mandates, people who support having vaccination mandates, the main rationale behind imposing mandates for vaccinations revolves around the concept of herd immunity. Okay, so we are in the middle of a pandemic right now. So you probably have seen the word herd immunity or heard it mentioned on the news. What exactly is herd? Herd immunity is achieved when a critical portion, typically 95% of a community, is immunized against a contagious disease. Most members of the community are protected against that disease when we achieve herd immunity, because there is going to be little opportunity for an outbreak to take place. In the diagram on the left, blue people represent those who are healthy but non-vaccinated. And we have the yellow people who represent healthy individuals who are vaccinated. So as you can see in this population, a majority of the people are unvaccinated. So what happens is when a person gets sick, when an unvaccinated person gets sick, it's very easy for this person to infect all the non-vaccinated individuals in the community, and that could result in an outbreak happening quite quickly. In the diagram on the right, you can see a majority of the population is vaccinated and protected against illness, shown here by, again, all these yellow people. And so when someone gets sick, right, it's more difficult for this person to spread it to others. Okay, so you might have some unvaccinated individuals in the population. Right? They might not be vaccinated because they are immunocompromised, for example. And so they rely on the protections of other individuals, right? The vaccinated people essentially shield them away from the infected person. Okay, in that way, when herd immunity is achieved, then an outbreak is not going to happen. Another argument for having mandate is that the benefits of vaccination far outweighs the risks associated with vaccination. As an analogy, we can think of driving. We all know car accidents can happen, and sometimes car accidents can result in serious injuries or even death. But most people will continue to drive despite of knowing such risks. Most people will not say, you know, I'm not going to drive anymore because I don't want to die in a car accident, right? That's because driving saves a lot of time compared to the small risk of getting into a car accident, right? So people accept the risk of driving and they continue to drive. So similar logic applies to vaccination, right? The protection offered by vaccination far outweighs, right, any risk associated with it. Here is a similar argument, okay? The risk associated with not getting vaccinated are significantly higher than the risk associated with vaccination. So again, I'll use an analogy to help you understand. You can think about eating, okay? So the risk of dying from starvation, okay, from not eating, is significantly higher than the risk of dying from choking when you do eat, okay? So why wouldn't you eat, right? It's the same kind of logic. Another argument to support having vaccination mandate is something called harm principle. It's something a British philosopher, John Stuart Mill, which is this guy right here, he came up with this concept of harm principle. The harm principle states that the only justification for interfering with the liberty of an individual against his or her will is to prevent harm to others, which basically means a person's is basically free to do as they wish unless their action results in the harm of others. So in the context of vaccination, if a person choose not to vaccinate, they might become infected and with a potentially deadly illnesses and spread it to other people's in the community and therefore imposing harm. Similarly, if parents choose not to vaccinate their kids and send them to school, then it endangers other kids at the school and potentially harming them by spreading diseases to them. So in that regard, the harm principle support vaccination mandates. Now let's talk about arguments for opposing mandates. The first argument is personal liberty concern. Some view mandates as government's intrusion into what's considered as a personal medical choice, and that forcing someone to be vaccinated contradicts with the premise of informed consent of medical ethics. We're going to talk more about consent later on. And people think that having a vaccination mandate will also violate the Charter of Rights and Freedom. Another argument has to do with safety and accountability concern. This argument accuses the public health community of conspiring with, or at least willfully complying to powerful vaccine manufacturers at the expense of citizens. Some people dismiss this argument as conspiracy theory and it's without merit, but in countries without democratic government, this is a genuine concern. Another concern is that forced vaccination occurs before long-term effects of the vaccines are studied. There are several unfortunate examples where unsafe vaccines were made available to public too soon. One such example is the so-called the Qatar incident. On April 12, 1955, the government announced the first vaccine to protect kids against polio. Okay, polio causes paralysis in kids, and within days, labs had made thousands of lots of vaccines and batches made by one company, the Qatar lab, they accidentally contain live viruses that was not inactivated in the vaccine, and people who received those vaccines actually got the real polio virus. So remember, we talked about the types of viruses, the type of vaccines in the last lecture, and the polio vaccine was supposed to contain an inactivated form of the virus. But what happened here is they forgot to inactivate the virus and then they gave the vaccines out. So what happened was more than 200,000 children got the polio vaccine that was with the actual virus in it, and they naturally has contracted the polio from these defective vaccines, and so within days the government had to abandon the program. So you can read more about several other examples of in history where rolling out the vaccines too early has caused a bit of problem. And there's a good CNN article here that you can take a look and see. Currently, there are multiple COVID-19 vaccines under development, and there is kind of this global race in trying to come up with the vaccines that is going to help end the pandemic, hopefully. There's no doubt we need an urgent end to the pandemic. Economies around the world are crashing. Governments are piling up trillions of dollars in debt, and so it's understandable that we are there's an urgency in creating the vaccines. But many people worry that the vaccines are being rushed and safeties are being overlooked. In a New York Times article, it reported that a drug company in China is giving unproven COVID-19 vaccines to thousands with without knowing what the associated risks might be. Now, the report didn't say that these vaccines were mandatory in China, but you can see how in a situation like this, the argument against having a mandate is quite valid, and you can read more about this situation in the link here. Now, because of stories like these, people are concerned, people are worried, and there is going to be some distrust from the public related to COVID-19 vaccines whenever it's going to be available. Okay, so public health worries that even when a safe vaccine for COVID-19 is available, many people might choose not to get it because of the distrust that we talked about. And as a result, the pandemic might last longer than anticipated. So the CEO of 9 pharmaceutical giants, right, including names like Pfizer, Johnson Johnson, Novavax, all these big pharma companies, they come together and they sign a pledge and saying that the company is committed to vaccine safety when it comes to developing the COVID-19 vaccine. And in signing the pledge, the companies hope to restore the public confidence in the vaccine and kind of ease some of the distrust. Another argument for opposing mandate is potential contradiction with religious belief. So we can look at HPV vaccination as an example. HPV, which stands for the human papilloma virus, is something that can be contracted through STD. Okay, it's a sexually transmitted disease. So contracting HPV will actually increase the risk of certain types of cancer. Okay, so in females, if they contracted HPV, they are more likely to develop cervical cancer later on in life. So in Ontario, there is an HPV vaccination program. The HPV vaccines are offered to grade 7 and grade 8 boys and girls to prevent the risk of contracting HPV. Now, just to be clear, the HPV vaccination is voluntary. It is not under the mandate list that we saw earlier. However, there are some religious concerns that receiving the HPV vaccine to protect against STD at such a young age will contradict with the common message of many religions, and that is to practice abstinences, right? So in many religions, the message is there should be no premarital sex, and so if you are giving the kids these HPV vaccines to prevent an STD at such a young age, it completely contradicts with that kind of teaching in many religions. And this was certainly the case with Catholic School Board when the HPV vaccination program was introduced across Canada. It's not just Alberta that's going against the HPV vaccines. This was true across the countries, and it's based on the argument that by having the HPV vaccine, it actually might encourage premarital sex, and that's something that's against the Catholic teachings. So those are the arguments for supporting as well as opposing vaccination mandates. The next ethical issue we will be discussing relates to research and testing. Vaccine development often takes a very long time and goes through vigorous safety and efficacy standards. However, the experts involved in the process might have conflicting priorities and motives, which contributes to various ethical discussion. For example, vaccine manufacturers, health officials, and medical journals may have financial and bureaucratic reasons for not wanting to acknowledge the risk of vaccines. And conversely, some advocacy groups who are against vaccination may have legislative and financial reasons to sponsor research that finds risks in vaccines. Perhaps the best example of this is what's happening in the US right now. The 2020 presidential election is on November 3rd, while on his camping trail, President Donald Trump repeatedly claimed that the COVID-19 vaccine is just weeks away from being made available to the public, okay, just before the election day. If that happens, it will likely give Trump a big boost in voter support. However, given that it typically takes several years to develop a vaccine, as we discussed earlier, the shortened time frame that's presented by Donald Trump here is raising concern that political pressure could override the normal regulatory process for vetting a vaccine. And Trump had initially suggested that he might reject tougher FDA vaccine standards because he thinks they're just political maneuvers. In the end, the White House did give the green light on FDA stricter guidelines for getting and COVID-19 vaccine approval. But you know, as you can see, this is a perfect example of where there are conflicting priorities between various stakeholders during the vaccine development process. While the outcome of this example tilted in favor of vaccine safety, it might not always be the case for countries that do not have a government constructed based on democracy. Another ethical concern related to vaccine research has to do with the way that testings are being done. So let's go through some basic concepts of how research is typically done. To test the efficacy of a treatment, in this case, the efficacy of the vaccine, researcher needs to test it on two groups of people. So we have the people who are in the control group, or sometimes we call them the placebo group. These are people who are going to be receiving an inert substance, which means this vaccine that they're receiving contains the exact same ingredient as the actual vaccine, but minus the active ingredient. Okay, so essentially they are not receiving the protection. And in the treatment group, this is the group that is going to be receiving the actual experimental vaccine. And so afterwards, you would compare the two groups and see how many people contracted the disease. If you have more people getting ill in the control group than the vaccinated group, then that suggests that you would have an effective vaccine. Let's look at the Ebola outbreak that happened in 2014 to 2016 as an example of how there are various ethical concerns related to the testing process. So first of all, some background information of Ebola. Symptoms of Ebola include fever, severe headache, abdominal pain, and so on and so forth. They're all listed here. And it is spread through blood or body fluids of a person who is sick with or has died from Ebola. Okay, so even after the person has passed away, their body is still infectious and could potentially infect others. Objects that have been contaminated with body fluids like blood, feces, or vomit from a sick person with Ebola can also spread the disease. And so it's very, very contagious in that sense. The average Ebola fatality rate is around 50%, which is extremely, extremely high. Okay, and when you look at past outbreaks, the fatality rate varies from as low as 25%, which is still pretty high. Okay, for a disease, to as much as 90%, depending on where the outbreak occurs. So what contributes to the rapid spread of the virus? Well, usually these outbreaks happen in developing countries, okay? Some outbreaks occurred in West Africa, and there are outbreaks that are happening in the Congo. And so in these developing countries, they typically have weak surveillance system. If you don't know who's getting sick, if you cannot do contact tracing properly, for example, then it becomes very difficult to contain the virus. The next reason is because of poor public health infrastructure. Okay, you might not be able to put infected patients in isolation, so they continue to spread to others. And poor sanitation is also a problem. Remember, these things, the Ebola is spread through bodily fluids, right, including fecal matter. And if there is no proper sanitizing facility in these countries, then it's very easy for the contaminating materials to go into say food source or water supply, and as a result, the virus typically spread quite rapidly when there is an outbreak. In one case, 28 individuals were infected from a single burial ceremony because remember, even when an infected person passed away, the body fluid remains infectious. So if people were handling the body of the diseased person without wearing protective equipment, chances are they are going to get infected as well. So the impact of this epidemic had on the world, and particularly in West Africa, is significant. It started in West Africa, and as you can see from these two maps, just from August 2014 to March 2015, the number of cases have increased rapidly, and it spread to the neighboring regions quite rapidly as well. By the end of the epidemic, a total of more than 28,000 cases and 11,315 deaths were reported in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. And there were additional 36 cases and 15 deaths that occurred when the outbreak spread outside of these three countries. In other words, this was quite serious, and an urgent solution was needed. So due to the high rate at which Ebola is spreading in West Africa, the need to develop an effective vaccine was necessary to halt the epidemic. The World Health Organization, WHO, has recommended jumping straight to phase 3 efficacy tests for the vaccines that is under development in seriously hit regions, countries, specifically Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. So here are some ethical concerns that were raised related to this Ebola vaccine development. In typical randomized clinical trials that we looked at earlier, half of the participants are going to be randomly assigned to the placebo group. And so they are going to be receiving a dummy shot, while the other half is going to be receiving the experimental shot. So the general consensus from ethicists in this setup is that it is okay to put people in placebo group and treatment group if it is unclear whether the vaccine will help, will do nothing, or will cause harm. Okay, so that's an acceptable, ethically acceptable way to do the testing. However, the situation for Ebola was a little bit different. Okay, there was an urgent need for a vaccine to be made available as soon as possible because the epidemic was raging on, and people are dying rapidly. And remember, the mortality rate is really high, right? So every day that goes pass on without a vaccine, more people are dying. So in this case, the experimental vaccine, when they did animal testing, it suggests that the vaccine could offer really good protection against the illness. Okay, this is based on animal data. And so when there is a potential life-saving vaccine and people are dying from the disease, then ethicists would argue that it is unethical to withhold such potential life-saving vaccines for the people. Okay, so in other words, they argue you perhaps should not have a placebo group because everybody deserves to have this potentially life-saving vaccines, even though it is still in the testing stage. Okay, so the ethical questions include should they have a placebo group at all? And if you don't have a placebo group, how do you assess whether or not the vaccine is working? And another question is who should participate? Should we prioritize people who work in healthcare, or should we prioritize the vulnerable population, maybe the old and the young? Who should get priority in that testing? Should we even include the vulnerables in the testing groups? Those are the questions that were raised. And finally, the last point is about when to mass produce the vaccines. If they wait until the final results are in, if they wait until the study is completed and then they mass produce the vaccines, then there will be a significant delay in deploying the vaccine because it takes time to make them, and that could potentially result in more death. Okay, because you have to wait for the vaccines to come, and people will continue to die as a result of not getting the protection. If you mass produce too early, okay, if you make a lot of it before the final results are in, then you risk having a bunch of vaccines that might not work in humans. Okay, it was very promising in animals, but there's no guarantee that you can replicate the results in humans. So if you mass produce all these vaccines and the results turns out that it's not effective in human, then you waste a lot of resources and money into something that's not working. Okay, so those are some of the ethical concerns related to the Ebola situation. Next ethical issues is about informed consent. To give informed consent, a person needs to be, number one, capable of making the decision. So we have to have someone who is going to have the mental capacity to make the decision. They have to have the maturity to make that decision. And if they are capable of making such decision, they would need to be given information about their health condition, the recommended treatment, any alternative options to treatment, as well as the likely outcomes and risks of either accepting or refusing the treatment. So once the person has been given this information, they will then be able to make an informed decision on whether or not they will be receiving the treatment. So that's basically the essence of informed consent. Under the Public Health Act for immunization, when a physician determines that a patient is incapable with respect to a treatment, then consent must be obtained from the incapable patient's substitute decision maker. Okay, which means if the person is not able to make a decision themselves, maybe they are incapacitated, or maybe they don't have the mental alertness and mental capability of making such decision, then a substitute decision maker is going to make the decision on their behalf. So here are some possible substitute decision maker. It can be the person's spouse, a sibling, a child or a parent, and if the person doesn't have any relatives, they might have appointed an attorney in the power of attorney for personal care with authority to make decisions related to treatment. Okay, so if someone had made a living will, for example, and in the will they declared a power of attorney for personal care, then that person could legally be the substitute decision maker. And sometimes that power of attorney can be one of the person's family member, then that's certainly okay as well. The ethical concerns arise when we look at consent for kids. There are numerous headlines about angry parents where their child got vaccinated at school without the parental consent. So that begs the question, do parents actually legally have the final say when it comes to vaccination for their kids? How old does the child have to be before they can make their own decision? Under the Healthcare Consent Act, the HCCA, immunization is actually considered as a treatment, okay, a treatment for prevention of diseases, and therefore to receive vaccination would require consent from the persons receiving the shot. So is there a minimum age before the person can make an informed consent? Well, you might be a little bit surprised to know that there is actually no minimum age requirement for giving vaccination consent in Ontario. Under the Act, it states that healthcare practitioner and evaluators, so sometimes it could be like a nurse or something like that, should use professional judgment, taking into account the circumstances and the client, and in this case, the client is going to be like the kid receiving the vaccination, to take into consideration the client's condition to determine whether the client has the capacity to understand and appreciate the information relevant to making the decision. In other words, if a teen has the ability to understand the risks and the benefit of what they're agreeing to and seems to be making a reasonable decision that is good for their health, then the health practitioner will generally follow their decision regardless of what their parents think. Okay, so this is also true in Nova Scotia and Northwest Territory, as well as Nunavut. Okay, there are no minimum age for consent when it comes to healthcare. It's a little bit different in other parts of Canada. In New Brunswick, Newfoundland, PEI, and Yukon, for example, the age for consent for healthcare is 16. Whereas in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the minimum age is 18. So, you know, there is some variations across the countries. But again, in Ontario, right, and a few other provinces, there are no minimum age regarding consent for vaccination. So here is the consent form that is being sent home for grade 7 and grade 8 for the HPV vaccination that we talked about. So HPV vaccination is only recommended and not mandated. So they would send home the consent form and ask the kids to ask their parents to sign it. So based on what we discussed, let's consider this scenario. Okay, so a kid takes this form home and then the parents decided that, or the guardian decided that they would not let their child receive the HPV vaccination for whatever reason. Okay, so they checked off no and returned the form to the school. And then what happens is, even though the parents has opted out to not have a shot for the kids, after speaking to the school nurse, for example, the child decided that, you know, receiving this HPV vaccine is actually beneficial for him or for her, and they could then override their parents' decision to receive the shot. So many people worry that, many parents worry that their children might be coerced into taking the shot without fully understanding, you know, what they're going through. So, you know, there are some ethical concerns there, and there are certainly arguments from both sides. There was a case in the U.S. Surrounding this teen. His name is Ethan Leinenberger, and he's from Ohio. Okay, at the time he was 18, but he never received vaccines for anything. Okay, he didn't have vaccines to protect him from diseases like hepatitis, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, and so on and so forth, because his mother does not believe in vaccination. Okay, his mother, as he puts it, was anti-vaxxer, and he said that much of his mother's opposition to routine vaccines came from fear that they could cause side effects like brain damage or autism. So he actually, you know, went on Reddit and asked for advice, and after doing some research, he found that the link between vaccination and autism was actually not true, and it has been disproved many times already. And so, going against his mother's point of view, he went ahead and got himself vaccinated. And here is him testifying in front of Congress to defend his action. Now, at the time, right, Ethan was 18, so he was legally an adult, and his mother cannot actually stop him from getting the vaccinations. But if you go on Reddit and look at some of the threads, there are a lot of minors who are in similar situations. So they are not yet 18 and they have not been vaccinated, and there is actually no good way for them to get the vaccines because under most states, the legal age to get medical procedure without parents' consent is 18, and so there is certainly concerns from these young people, fearing that they're going to contract, measles, for example, right? Because they're not protected. So the consent aspect of vaccination is a hot topic, I guess, for from the parents' perspective as well as from the child's perspective. The last ethical issue we will look at is access disparities. Many vaccines-related ethical debates centered on the evidence that access to vaccination actually depends to some extent on socioeconomic and racial ethnic minority status. Implicit in these discussion is actually the question of whether or not all lives are of equal value and equally deserving of opportunities to be protected by vaccination. So globally, low-income children and children without health insurance can face challenges in receiving vaccinations. And in terms of racial ethnic minority status, vaccination coverage is typically significantly lower amongst non-Hispanic blacks, Hispanic and non-Hispanic Asians compared to non-Hispanics. There is also the issue of supply and demand. The demand for vaccine is the greatest when the disease is spreading rapidly, and many people are dying from the disease, like the current pandemic that we're experiencing. A lot of people dying from COVID-19, so there is a huge demand for creating the vaccines. And take Ebola as an example again. Almost a decade ago, scientists from Canada and the US reported that they had actually created a vaccine that was 100% effective in protecting monkeys against Ebola. The results were actually published in some respected journals, and health officials call them exciting. But the researcher said that they could actually start testing it in people within 2 years, and a product could potentially be ready for licensing very soon, but it never happened. The vaccine basically just sat on the shelf after the animal data came in. And the reason was because at the time there was no Ebola outbreak. Okay, there was no Ebola happening. People weren't dying from the disease, and so there was very little financial incentive in investing and developing an Ebola vaccine. So that same vaccine was actually pulled from the shell after nearly 5,000 people died from the Ebola outbreak that we talked about earlier. When there was an epidemic raging out of control in West Africa, then all of a sudden, companies want to invest in money in developing these vaccines. Had the vaccines been developed earlier when there was no outbreak, then maybe lives could be saved. And that's the supply and demand issues that we're talking about here. Take the coronavirus as an example again. So there are different types of coronaviruses, right? There are coronavirus that caused the SARS outbreak in 2003, and there are coronavirus that caused MERS outbreak. So in 2003, there was the SARS outbreak. Okay, and again, just like COVID-19, SARS is caused by coronavirus. So here is a scientist, Dr. Peter Hotez, and his team. They wanted to get funding to create the for their studies in the corona vaccines, and they want to test whether or not it works on humans, because early animal results were promising, but at the time when they applied for fundings, the SARS outbreak was over. Okay, people thought the SARS outbreak was going to last much longer than it did, and for some reason it just kind of died out, and it ended quite quickly. So by the time people had some tangible data on the corona virus vaccines, there was suddenly no urgent need for such vaccines anymore, and so funding dried up, and much like the Ebola vaccine case, these experimental projects just got put on hold and has been sitting on the shelf, and people are criticizing nowadays of such decision. Had we developed a coronavirus vaccine back then maybe we would have something to work with for the current pandemic. Now, having a vaccine for SARS is not necessarily going to mean that you can use the same vaccines for COVID-19. But then again, they are the same virus, so their genetic constructs are quite similar. So maybe having that SARS vaccine will jumpstart the production of a COVID-19 vaccine. We will never know. Okay, but the point here is there's a huge supply and demand ethical concerns here. Okay, if we always wait until there is an outbreak for certain diseases to create the vaccine, then we will always be one step behind. But at the same time, no one wants to fund a project to create a vaccine that is not in high demand, right? So global health disparities are even more extreme, and it highlights additional ethical dilemmas. Many developing countries face threats from disabling and deadly infections that are so-called poverty disease. Okay, so these are diseases that only happens in poor countries. So things like hookworms, leprosy, they are virtually unknown in most of North Americas. And although vaccines can help prevent these diseases, and vaccine developments could occur in developed countries, they often will lag behind the community needs in these developing countries. So places affected by poverty disease often lack the infrastructure to support wide-scale vaccination. So even if Western countries is willing to invest and make these vaccines available to these poorer countries, they might not have the infrastructures to deploy the vaccines. And many of these places, have competing priorities between health and social needs, and there are other needs such as poverty and violence, and even basic infrastructures. So for them, vaccinations might not be the top priorities, and there are also issues, right? Surrounding costs. There are little financial incentive for big pharmaceutical companies to invest in developing vaccines for a disease in low-income countries, where they're not likely to be able to afford it. And this is where the rich and the wealthy philanthropists comes in. Okay, people like Bill Gates. So we talk about the Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in an earlier lecture, in lecture 1, I believe. And one of the commitments of the Gates Foundation is that they're committed to eradicating polio worldwide. Remember, the goal of vaccination is to eradicate, eliminate, or control. And we have only been able to eradicate smallpox so far. So we were very close to eradicating polio. Actually, as you can see in this Bill Gates posters, right? We're this close in ending polio. So over the past 3 decades, the world has made tremendous progress towards the eradication of polio. Immunization efforts have actually reduced the number of cases by more than 99%. Okay, and that translates to saving more than 13 million kids from paralysis. And India has actually stopped the virus completely in 2011. And today, polio is only found in small pockets in countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. So as of 2016, because of efforts from the Gates Foundation, there were fewer than 40 cases reported globally. Okay, so we were very, very, very close in eliminating them. But efforts to reach unvaccinated children are often hampered by security risk and geographic as well as cultural barriers. And not to mention that to run a vaccination campaign like this actually costs a lot of money. It's estimated to be around $1 billion US dollars per year. So that kind of price is not sustainable for long term, even for the super wealthy. Okay, but efforts are being carried out to try to eradicate polio. And that is it for this lecture. Those are the key ethical issues surrounding vaccinations. And I guess just to relate back to the theme of the course. At the beginning, we talked about life expectancy has been increasing over the past few decades, right? And much of it was because of advances in medicine, right? Particularly the discovery and creation of vaccines. And with people getting vaccinated, then some diseases that were causing a lot of deaths, like measles and mumps and polios, all of a sudden those diseases are gone, and that has significantly increased the life expectancy of individuals. So where do we go from here? Well, if people are not vaccinating as much nowadays, right, for various reasons, there is the anti-vaccine movement, for example, then with a decline in vaccination rate, then preventable diseases might be coming back. So some examples include measles reappearing in Disneyland, right, a couple of years ago, and actually in Canada as well. And there are resurgence of polio cases as well. And with the return of these diseases, life expectancy could be expected to drop. Right, and with new threats like COVID-19 and Ebola, things that we don't have an effective vaccines for just yet, those kind of pandemics, those kind of outbreaks can significantly reduce the longevity of the human race. So that's it for lecture 3, and next week we will be learning about another medical breakthrough that has significantly increased the life expectancy of people, of individuals, and that is the discovery of antibiotics. So thank you for watching, and I will see you again next week.